But we start with the latest from NATO and its response to Russia's war on Ukraine. This weekend, NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Germany. This week, traditionally neutral Finland announced it is now seeking to join the alliance. Its neighbor Sweden is expected to follow. Also this week, Canada announced an upgrade to its mission in Latvia to deter Russian aggression. Joining me now is Kerry Buck. She is a former Canadian ambassador to NATO. Ms. Buck, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, let's start with this request from Finland to join NATO. One of the things that's come up just in the hours since we had that news yesterday is that we're hearing that the Turkish president is saying he's toying with the idea of opposing that request because Turkey is a member of NATO and I believe it takes unanimous consent of all members before someone can join. What do you make of all of this?
Well, yes, NATO requires consensus before decisions are made on every decision of NATO. And the fact that this has been announced publicly by Finland and was signaled by NATO Sec-Gen Jens Stoltenberg as early as beginning of April that Finland and likely Sweden would want to join the alliance. Those announcements wouldn't have happened unless there'd been very careful diplomatic work with every member of the alliance to make sure that the path to NATO membership for Finland was not going to be blocked. So this latest public musing by President Erdogan, I will have to see how seriously NATO needs to take that and what it is that Turkey's looking for.
Okay. Now, when we look at the two Scandinavian countries, and we were mentioning Finland, but it's also widely bruited about that Sweden will also follow suit. They are traditionally neutral countries. We now know the new context of why they've put in this request. If, as you say, this has been in the works, how long would it possibly take before an official decision is made to accept them into NATO?
Well, Jens Stoltenberg had already said publicly that they would find a fast-track way of doing this, and I think we're seeing a fast track right now. Technically, a member state doesn't become a member state until all of the allies have ratified amendments to the treaties. Okay. And so it will take a while, but what's important to notice is that the UK signed bilateral agreements with Finland and Sweden just a couple of days ago. The US has quietly, but it's come out in public, said that there are some assurances from the US, and then Sweden and Finland also have some measure of assurances because of their membership in EU. So that interim period that could be dangerous, perhaps, where Russia will seek to dissuade Finland and Sweden from joining the alliance, that message about assurances from some NATO allies with some pretty heavy hardware is an important message to send to Russia. Okay. And so you'll see things like gray zones, cyber, disinformation, maybe more than that coming from the Russians, but it's a period of risk, but the risk has been attenuated by those assurances from other allies.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, man. We heard Vladimir Putin say that Finnish membership, and I think you would probably include Swedish membership, he says that would constitute a threat to Russia's security. What do you make of what he's saying? I mean, in a way, that fits in with what he's been saying, his narrative, since the beginning of the week when we had the Victory of Europe Day. He was saying that this whole intervention in Ukraine is caused by a NATO conspiracy. But what do you make of his latest comments?
Well, few points. First off, the reason that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine was not because Ukraine was up for NATO membership. Yeah. The language around Ukraine becoming a member of NATO was put on the table in 2008. There was no mention at the time of when that would happen, and there'd been no formal movement at all from NATO in Ukraine's path to membership. So that's a bit of propaganda coming from the Russians. Yeah. It's not the reason he invaded. So the fact that Ukraine and Sweden, Finland and Sweden are coming closer to NATO membership, yeah, it'll increase the risk, but what it'll cause the Russians to do, they've given themselves some wiggle room. What they said yesterday, their spokesperson, was that, the Russian reaction will depend on how this thing unfolds. And so we saw today Russia cut off, I think it was Finland's electricity supply. You'll see disinformation for sure. They've been doing that for years. Every time NATO membership comes up in either of those two countries, there's disinformation campaigns. So you will see a Russian reaction, but how robust, remains to be seen. But I think the Russians understand that it would be folly to do anything directly against Finland or Sweden militarily.
So in a way, you're saying that they are benefiting by potential NATO protection already.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you said at the beginning that they're neutral. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they haven't been part of the alliance, but for the last few decades, they've been very, very close partners of the alliance. They've been embedded in a lot of NATO planning. They've deployed with NATO missions. They've trained and exercised with NATO troops. And they've been at the table for a lot of discussions before decisions, and almost every discussion of Ukraine since February 24th, since the invasion. So while not members of the alliance, I think neutrality is a hard way to describe it, at least for the past few decades. And they're NATO interoperable already. They've got, they satisfy all the criteria of NATO membership in spades. Functioning democracy, market economy, rule of law respected, no corruption, and really interoperable troops.
Okay, well, let's get to the other announcement. Yesterday, Justin Trudeau announced that Canada is now sending senior staff, including a general, to lead the NATO Forward Battle Group in Latvia. We already have 700 Canadian Forces members there, and now some would argue that this leadership makes sense. What does this mean? The Latvian Prime Minister says he'd like to see a permanent NATO presence and for it to become more than what's been called a tripwire, but a real deterrent to the Russians. What do you make of the announcement yesterday?
Well, I think the announcement yesterday is a natural progression from the leadership Canada's been showing in forward presence since it came into place in 2016. I was NATO ambassador at the time. Yes, deterrence now, post-February 24th, NATO deterrence has to shift from what we call tripwire deterrence to deterrence through defense. And what that means is that the troop numbers, it wasn't like the old Cold War. So the troop numbers in the Baltics, in those 4 forward presence battalions, would be enough to signal political presence, and that if the Russians were to come in, although they might be able to come into territory, NATO would then have the time and would come back in force. Right. But it wouldn't be stopping them at the border. So the idea now is that you need to have more presence along the border to be able to deter through defense. So a stop line instead of a tripwire. And I think that's necessary because of the it's more than necessary because of the Russian aggression of marching across borders. And as I said, the Canadian leadership at the time in 2016, it wasn't a given. We hadn't been in Europe with a big troop presence for many decades. It was actually Prime Minister Trudeau's dad who was the Prime Minister who had pulled most of them out. Okay. But we did, and we exercised that leadership, and we're there leading Latvia, so this makes sense what we're doing now. Okay,
last question in a word. Do we have anywhere near that presence, though, that's now required on the borders of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania?
Well, we is NATO, not Canada alone, right? Canada's there with the Latvian troops and a number of other NATO allies. I think so, honestly. And Russia's also a little bit busy losing in Ukraine right now.
Okay. Well, listen, we will speak again about the war and the general efforts and the arms exports. I want to thank you very much for walking us through these latest developments.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. Bye-bye.